Okay, so welcome to episode 4 of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in so far. Don't forget, feel free to flick this to friends. We're available on all good spots where you can get your podcast, and for the ones that you can't get it from, it's obviously not a good spot.
That's right.
So today we are going to be talking about sex and church. There's a whole lot of stuff around this, obviously. I mean, sexuality is a huge thing within faith-based areas, and
I dare say this will not be the only episode we'll ever do on this topic.
No, absolutely not. And it'll probably be weaved in and out of a lot of stuff because it is an enormous focus, that personal purity. So anyway, I think T, you've got some really good examples around this, and we're going to kick off with you.
So remembering I started in the Revival Centre, which again is a cult. I think it's really important, though, to highlight that because our experiences, were very different, that I came from this religious cult and then joined the Assemblies of God or the mainstream sort of Pentecostal scene, and you didn't. And so that's going to colour my stories. You know?
Yeah, I think it is quite different. I mean, obviously, the Assemblies of God, but cultish type behaviour, but certainly not the hardcore cult that you came from.
Yeah, exactly right, yeah. So the Revival Centres were obsessed with sex.
Yeah.
It was actually, as young people, the dangers and the evils of sex. You could be kicked out of the Revival Centres for life for having sex.
Really?
Yeah.
Having sex
outside of marriage. Yeah. And they would force marriages. Young people would not even have full frontal intercourse. They could just touch each other, dry hump or whatever, and the church would force them to get married.
God.
Yeah, I know, it's pretty crazy. So there's no doubt that I was a bit warped and messed up by the whole sort of, revival centre around sex. So that's where I'd come from. And in between the revival centre and joining the AOG, I just went and partied and clubbed and, just a whole lot of, I guess I'd call it maladaptive coping strategies, right? Yeah. And part of that was I had girlfriends and I slept with them and, I had, it was the 80s, so there was, one night stands and all that kind of stuff. So I certainly wasn't a prude, but I think my views of sex is I took it probably, I was more intense about it, I think, because of my time in the Revival Centre. But when I joined the AOG and what we're calling Great Big AOG, which was, one of the largest in the cities that we lived in, they also were quite prudish or quite serious, I think, about sex. And when I joined, there was a young girl who was basically on the fringes of the church. She was on her way out. Okay. And I was on my way in. And we kind of met metaphorically at the door. And I think, she saw that I'd come in, dressed in sort of, clubbed out sort of gear and, very sort of trendy and fashionable and all that kind of thing. And she had, she'd been very church her whole life. And I think she was attracted to that. But she was, attracted to where I'd come from more than maybe just me. Yeah. So she actually started up a relationship with me, and I with her. She was a very pretty girl. And I wasn't interested because I was like trying to get into church and trying to be more religious. I'd, really recommitted myself at that point. And she was the opposite. Yeah. So when we started hanging out and, seeing each other at night and that kind of stuff, she was pressing me to have sex. Yeah. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. That's, I wanted to be more, more for Jesus and more religious and that kind of thing. But she was very pretty, right? And I was still, only in my low 20s. And so a couple of times we did, right? We did have sex. And she was all very new to it. Yeah. And I wasn't. And so I won't pretend that it was great, but it happened, right? So anyway, few months later, we'd stopped seeing each other and she actually left church and went out and she basically went to where I'd come from. She started clubbing and, drinking and all that kind of stuff and, God bless her, and off she went. But a few months later, I get a call from one of the youth pastors. Yeah. I'm going to call him Pastor J. And Pastor J rings me up and says, hey, seeing you've been coming along to the church and all that kind of stuff, and I'd really like to get to know you and everything. Do you want to meet up? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And he lived not far from me. And I didn't have a car, so he said, "Look, I'll come and get you. We'll go for a drive."
Okay.
So I said, "Okay, cool." So he came pick me up, and we went for a drive. We're driving around the streets of my suburb, and he's talking to me, and he's asking me all these questions about, where have you come from, and all really sort of generic, I don't know, concerned questions. It was nice, you know what I mean? He was genuinely asking me about who I was, and the church that I come from, unless you're in trouble, the pastors didn't talk to you at all, right? The cult that I come from.
Okay.
So this was actually really good, and I was thinking this is cool. And he's asking me about how did I come to know God, and I told him about where I'd come from a little bit. I didn't go into too much detail because at the same time, because he was called pastor, I didn't trust him.
Yeah.
Because of the whole cult thing.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, and so we're driving along, and it's all going well, and I was feeling really good, and I was thinking this church is so different to where I've come from, and isn't it great, and it's so much better, and I was feeling really good about my choice. And as we turned into my street, probably drove for about 40 minutes, and he started to ask me all these questions and everything, and it just seemed to show a genuine interest in me, a genuine concern. Anyway, he turned into my street, and as we're coming up to my place, he pulled over, and then he says to me, he looked at me with this concerned look, and he goes, "Look, I've heard a rumour." And I was like, "What?" And then at that moment, as you can imagine, everything that I had experienced from my cult experience just came rushing back.
Yeah, of course.
He's like, "I've heard a rumour." And then he starts asking me if I had been sleeping with S.
Yep.
And I just looked at him, and in my mind was, I will never experience what I've experienced in the cult ever again.
Yeah.
This is not your business, I was thinking to myself. So he's asking me questions. I just denied everything.
Yeah.
But he's asking me, did you sleep with it? Who initiated it? All this kind of stuff. And I just was denying it. No, I didn't. No one initiated it. And just deny. And he kept asking because he'd heard it.
Yeah.
And he obviously believed it.
Okay.
And he was trying to get me to confess that this was what was going on. And I just denied it. And then he said, "Oh, okay." He got out of the car. I got out of the car and he drove away. And I just remember as he drove away, looking at him driving away and just thinking, this is the same.
Yeah.
Right? He's sitting there asking me about, part of me was sort of saying to myself, "Oh, I could have told them."
Yep.
Because this isn't the revival centre.
Yeah.
And I spoke to a friend of mine who I'll call R, who's sort of, evangelising me into Great Big AOG. And he said, "Yeah, you could have told him. It's not the same. You could have told him." But part of me was just going, "No."
Did he let up? After that, was there any more questioning or?
No, there wasn't any more questioning from then. But after talking with R, I went to see another pastor in our church, another youth pastor who I'll call Pastor B.
Yeah.
And I went and saw him and told him.
Okay.
And said, "Actually, Pastor J came and asked me all these questions." And he's like, "Oh, well, I'm really glad." And he was really cool about it, Okay. It wasn't like the revival centre where it's like, "Oh, really? Okay, well, see you in hell." You know what I mean? Like, goodbye, and you're never coming back because they kick you out for life.
Yeah.
He was actually quite warm about it and said, "Oh, okay, well, we just need to know because we need to keep purity in our church and all this, which we can unpack in a moment." But the other thing he said to me, "What really concerns me though, T, is why didn't you tell us in the first place?"
Yeah.
And I said to him, "Because I don't know you.
Yeah.
And why would I tell you?" And again, he was, very sort of accommodating and warm and all that kind of thing. And I walked out of there feeling really, really good.
Was there any consequence for that, or?
Well, it's funny you should say that because I walked out of there feeling really, really good.
Yeah.
But what I didn't know was in their minds, there's a big black book, and there was a big tick put next to my name, or a big cross, however you want to look at it, right?
Yeah.
Put next to my name that day that, "Oh, this is the guy that joins our church and bangs young girls that have been in our church their whole lives."
Yeah.
And again, at that time, I'm not saying I see it this way now, she was the one that came on to me. She was the one that, put... But even still, even if she did, who cares?
Yeah.
It was none of their business. So that's a story that's really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Because who goes to someone and asks them, and remember, I wasn't, at that stage, I wasn't a teenager anymore. I know I was a teenage fundamentalist. I was in my low 20s.
Yeah.
But who goes and asks a 20-something who you don't know who you're sleeping with. And
What do you think's behind that? Like you said before that, they need to keep purity. Do you think that's what's behind it? That they see themselves as the keepers of the purity?
I think there's a number of things going on there.
Yeah.
I think with Pastor Jay and getting to know him a little bit later, he wants to know everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Right? And especially gossip and that kind of thing. And this girl, she's very pretty. And she was known throughout the church as being very pretty.
Yeah.
And I dare say, on some sort of weird, warped level, you want to know who the pretty girl's banging, especially if she's not banging you.
I obviously know Pastor Jay as well, and I definitely identify with the whole needed to know everything. I often got questioned on many things, and he definitely would try and get intelligence from me on different things as well. So, what was behind it, I don't know, but I definitely think he tried to be across everything and be the eyes and get people to be the eyes and the ears for him. Yeah.
And I think there's also a level of trust that, if they can get you to tell them your deepest, darkest secrets and, and most intimate details, then they've got a level of control, a level of hold over you. Like even a school teacher doesn't have this sort of level of control, and they're some of the most controlling people in our lives, growing up. So I think that was part of it. But coming back to what you said about the purity, there was, I think Pastor B actually said to me that, there's verses in the Old Testament about needing, like the sin in the camp. Yeah. And they needed to remove the sin from the camp, meaning that it would affect the entire church if people are sinning secretly in the church, right? And that's the way that they saw premarital sex. So I think that was definitely a part of it. The purity of the entire group depended on two young people's genitals. Yeah. Which is pretty fucking full on, right? Yeah. But I think that's genuinely how they see it. So I don't think it's just that they want to know your deepest, darkest secrets for the sake of intelligence, as you put it. I think there is actually a doctrinal, dogmatic kind of belief that they are supposed to know and they need to know.
There's also strange responses to it, though. I remember in that group that there were a couple of people caught, for lack of a better word, sleeping together. Obviously not in the act, but very similar to you. People had dobbed them in. And I remember he definitely got the blame for it, and he was removed from the fold for like 3 months. He was banned from coming. And no pun intended. And he didn't come along for 3 months. And even at the time, I thought to myself, because I'd heard about, this was about grace, it was about love, it was about acceptance, but do something wrong and you don't get that. And it just didn't ring true to me. Even at that time, I just remember thinking, this is so contradictory. It was quite bizarre that the response to that was cast this guy out and cut him off for a few months. That'll teach him. Well,
that was very much the Revival Centre. That's how the Revival Centre started it. Originally, they didn't kick you out for life. They kicked you out for a time. Yeah. But I think the pastor started to see that it wasn't stopping anything. So he just made the punishment more severe, longer, until eventually you're out forever. And then they started to claim you're out forever, eternally.
Yeah.
So and that these guys all came from cut from the same block. They all have sort of a beginning together. So that's interesting that they were doing that, kicking people out for a period of time.
Yeah, there was a couple of guys that I knew directly that it happened. So it wasn't hearsay. I'd known them.
But you know what's interesting about that too, that I always find fascinating, is there's a list of sins, throughout the New Testament, and sexual immorality, as they call it, is one of them. But there's drunkenness, there's thieving, there's lying, there's slandering and all that. Did they put them out for that?
Well, this was also a mega church as such. It was full of incredibly wealthy people. There was a lot of greed. There certainly wasn't a great deal of social justice. There was
none at all.
No. Well, I remember...
Maybe later on, but not at the start.
Yeah, I remember a couple of occasions where some people who'd been living rough on the street came in, and they were ushered out quite quickly to sit up the back and not be amongst the fold because they might have smelt a little bit. So, I think there was a lot of judgment, but that wasn't seen as a purity issue. You know, it was seen as purity. She removed them; they're impure. But the purity of the body, in actually the body of Christ as they saw it, in accepting people, loving them, showing them grace, certainly wasn't up there on the list. It was making sure that they were protectors of the morals more so.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, how they think that, what happens between two people, two young people or older people, whatever, affects the entire group.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think is interesting is, how did they find out?
Yep.
Like with, it must have come from S's side. She must have told someone who, and confessed or felt bad or whatever, I don't know. And then somehow it filtered back to Pastor Jay, because it certainly didn't come from my side.
Yeah, well, they didn't have the technology of us all being nano-chipped after the COVID vaccine back then, so...
No, indeed.
But yeah, you're right. I think that people, and potentially with good intention, would be on the lookout for these things happening.
But that's what I mean, how they find out. And it's a degree of betrayal.
Yeah.
Because, like, for example, if I came to you and said, and this is how it would have happened then, I feel really bad. We actually had sex, and then for you to go off and report me, to someone, would be, it's a betrayal,
Yeah, and you wonder what's happening in people's minds to do that. But I think it's so fear driven, and it's so they want acceptance in that group that's what you do. That's what you do. You got to look out. So.
But a lot of married or young pre-married couples, right, engaged couples, you can't tell me that there's not a lot of hanky-panky going on there. There'd have to be, when the two people love each other, they're in their 20s,
100%. I mean, for me, I was in that scene, and I did get engaged and married while I was there, and I can tell you there was a lot of hanky-panking fooling around. I actually, Pastor B, who you refer to, we had gone in there for some pre-marriage counselling, so they had insisted on pre-marriage counselling before they would actually marry you. So this was several months out. Now, this time, my fiancée, she had, through a series of events, she'd been living with her family had moved away, she had to move somewhere. My parents said, why don't you just move in with us? So effectively, for the 12 months or whatever before we were married, we were living together. This hadn't come to the attention.
So when you say living together, sharing a room?
Well, technically we weren't. We were in two rooms, but I can tell you that every night we shared a room.
Right.
So absolutely. And, Pastor B had come across this, and
So he heard about this?
He had heard about it. And
so someone had looked out for you?
Oh, yes, someone had been on the lookout. And he started questioning us about it. And he said, what are you doing? Are you sleeping together? Are you... And
what did you say to him when he asked you, are you sleeping together?
We said no.
Okay, so you lied?
Yes.
Okay.
But he... there was a lot of pressure. And so I started talking to him, and maybe I was trying to justify it. Well, not maybe. I was trying to justify it in my own mind at the time. And I was saying, looked up, and in... Jewish families, quite often, if people get engaged, they move under the one roof, and it's almost seen as a bit of a trial period. And there's also guidance from the families to make sure that, they know what they're heading towards, blah, blah, blah. And he said, this isn't about Jewish families. We don't do this. So he was...
We're not Jewish. We're not Jewish. Yeah.
So, he was very clear that what we were doing was wrong, but it was really interesting, his response, because at that time I was a fairly senior leader in this church, and
in the youth,
and I didn't have and I was studying there at the time, so I was studying theology, and I was in full-time Bible college for at that time, so I expected some sort of backlash, but there wasn't. He said, not happy, not pleased with this, we don't endorse this, you should be living separately until you're married, blah, blah, blah. But he seemed satisfied, and he ended up marrying us. Although when he did pronounce us man and wife, he pronounced my then wife's name incorrectly.
Oh, nice.
And called her something else. So it was...
Cool. You know, when you say that he accepted it or, let it go and everything,
Yeah.
that surprises me.
It really surprised
Especially
me.
if you're in leadership and you're in Bible college and all that. I would have thought that they would have said to you, the standard is higher.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of stuff we used to get,
Yeah, totally. And maybe some of it was we're only a couple of months out from getting married, and he thought, well, nearly at the finish line, we'll let it go. I'm not sure.
Little did he know you were leavening the whole lump. You were
Well-
poisoning the whole body, dude.
Well, that's right. I mean, I if I had been able to bring that place down from inside, obviously I was close to it. So yeah, look, it was for me. I didn't actually. I empathised with him though at the time because I thought, he's doing his job, and he's,
So what made you resist? Was it a financial thing, or was it that you didn't want to be separate? You guys were in love, and
it was more so, yeah. Like she didn't really have anywhere to go. She was only working part-time, didn't have that. She'd actually tried living with one of the youth pastors at this place, and it just didn't work out well.
one of his family, he and his family.
Yeah, he and his family. So, God forbid she lived there just with
I
him.
just wanted to
Can you
clarify.
imagine?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that didn't work out too well. They were very intrusive. They wanted to know every detail of where she was going, and if she'd come home too late, it's like, what have you been up to? Where have you been? So in the end, she just said, look, I can't handle this. My parents said, hey, just move in here, and there we went. So, but there was a lot of focus on the individual or the individuals rather than the whole of the church's response.
And so, did you feel guilty when you guys
100%. And we were
like shockingly guilty, or just kind of confess, move on?
Well, pretty guilty. Confess, move on, do it again. Confess, move on, do it again. It was a cycle. We're stuck in a cycle. But it was interesting like that. I think it's just a I don't know. It was something we just had to get through, and we also saw the finish line and went, we're nearly married anyway.
Yeah.
So,
and that's when you start to justify it to yourself, don't you? You start to say, well, we're married in the eyes of God. Now it's just the paperwork. That kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there was a lot of that because there was a lot of unpacking the theological part of it. It was like, we're already married.
Yeah.
Technically.
I used to look at sort of the American church, right, as parts of the Australian group. We'd look across, and they just seem to be a little bit more flippant with the whole sex thing.
Yeah.
Especially the young people. Like they're all Christians and they're born again and they're speaking in tongues and they're baptized and they're doing all that. But the whole sex thing for them seemed to be a lot more permissible.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know why. Yeah. And, even though it was the mother culture, for us, especially as Pentecostals, a lot of it came from America. I just felt that we were more uptight, more pure about sex than they were.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I don't even know what was behind that, but and maybe it was just the scene we were in.
Yeah,
I'm not sure whether other less evangelical areas were a little bit more lax with it. I'm not sure. I mean, I remember there's a lot of stuff happening in Australia at that time, a lot of fear around. We had a campaign around the Grim Reaper bowling, and it was bowling people over the AIDS campaign. Yeah. And so there's a lot of fear that I certainly had it drummed into me in true ways through society, and be careful if you have unprotected sex, you're going to get AIDS and you'll die. And the church going, see, this is one of the things that happen. This is a curse that happens from it, and this is an effect on society when they step outside of God's will of having sex inside of marriage.
So you had it sort of put to you that AIDS was literally a curse from God because of sexual promiscuity and homosexuality and all that?
100%. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It was definitely drummed into me that. So, and I think it just reinforced a lot of the other rubbish at the time. So, and as you said before, and it might have been in the last podcast, you pick and choose your truths, and connect them all together to make up your story. And
totally.
I think that's what happened.
That's the thing about, we talk about fundamentalists being literalist with their view of the Bible, but they totally interpret and totally use things metaphorically,
Oh.
and then accuse someone else for being metaphorical about something that they're being literal about and saying we are the truth.
Yeah, it's just a big ball of hypocrisy,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
So,
Yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking, I did some reading a little while ago, and there was an apocryphal gospel, meaning that it's a gospel that didn't make it into the Bible.
okay.
And I think it's dated around the 3rd century. It might be a little bit later. But it's called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. And Thecla was one of Paul's female disciples, according to church tradition.
Okay.
And without going too deep into it, and please, it's available online. Go and have a look if you wanted to read it. But it's basically a gospel that is playing down sex, even sex inside marriage.
Yeah.
So Paul and Thecla were sort of held up as being amazing, even though there's this man and this woman traveling together, but they are totally celibate.
Yeah.
And this is God's will, and it's almost like it's God's will for everybody,
Yeah.
not just for Paul and Thecla. And so it was interesting that the early church was focused very much on this sort of sex is bad, sex is dirty, even inside marriage. Like, that's okay, but really what you want to do is not do it at all.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of played itself out with sort of nuns and priests and brothers and all that within the sort of Catholic and Orthodox traditions, that became the norm.
Yeah.
That became the higher path, was to not have sex at all. But I think we still see a lot of that in our experience anyway. There's still this kind of sex is dirty,
Absolutely.
sex is bad, even inside marriage.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, people in church, in the churches we went to, they didn't talk about it much.
No, I remember actually having a couple of conversations with people about this, what's permissible within marriage. And I remember a conversation about oral sex.
Yes.
There was a very...
I think I might have been in that conversation, man.
Quite possibly. And I remember the opposition was overwhelming against oral sex, because it's not...
Didn't you go to something once and the guy was saying that the spirit of oral sex is called succubus?
I don't know if that was me.
That wasn't that a demon thing you went to, and the guy was saying, "Oh, the demon of oral sex is called succubus."
It actually...
I'm pretty sure you told me that.
It rings a bell.
Whether you saw it or not, you told me that story, and it was like, that's I remember thinking, that's a bit convenient.
It's
called succubus.
It's comedy gold. Yeah, look, it's quite possible. I mean, some of that stuff was 30 years ago, so I can't remember everything, but it doesn't surprise me. It's quite a frightening scene, but again, they'll do anything to justify. So, but yeah, that whole thing, even within marriage, what is permissible, what is right, was very, very interesting. And I remember thinking, God, there's just so many rules, so many rules. And, not only are they trying to control what you do outside of marriage, but once you're married, what you do inside of that.
Yeah, that's right.
And if it's not about purity any longer. Yeah,
well, it's funny you say that, because that's how it was put to me. Because I went to someone else and said, what are we allowed to do?
Yeah. And
this guy actually said to me, he goes, I know what you're referring to. Like, we never actually said, am I allowed to go down on her? Is she allowed to go down on me? Married.
Yeah.
That wasn't, we just like, what are we allowed to do? And what he actually said to me is, he said, there's a verse in the Bible, I don't know where it is, said something about keeping the marriage bed pure.
Yeah.
And he said, as long as you're keeping the marriage, which is a non-answer.
Yeah.
Right? So we just did what we wanted.
Yeah.
My wife then in church, we just did what we wanted and tried to, I think, and in one sense the advice was kind of good, because what he was actually implying was, if one of you's not into it, then the other needs to be sort of considerate of that. Well, at least that's the way I took it. Yeah. Maybe that's not what he meant at all. Yeah. Maybe he just meant, get succubus out of your experience or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I remember, even if, pre-marriage, and it's talking masturbation. And,
man.
I mean, how...
What a fucking... God, don't get me started. The amount of guilt and shame and fucking everything. In the end, I was doing it because it was like, they told me it was the thoughts that were bad. So I would do it and not think. Right? I was a fucking Buddhist fucking wanker.
That sounds really boring.
I would like just not think about it, right? Think about the cricket or whatever and just, yeah.
I'm very concerned that you could do it thinking about cricket. But anyway,
I think I made that up.
Each to their own. I mean, I don't think you made it up. It's the first thing that come to your mind. But whatever, whatever floats your boat. But it was all consuming. And I remember people again, having arguments and counter-arguments around masturbation pulled from Scripture. Again, no pun.
No pun intended. Yeah.
But it was. And I remember this one guy in particular who, we should have called him Salad because he's obviously a mad tosser, but he just justified it through Scripture. And it's just like, dude, I don't care.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care. Have a pull.
But see, this is where you and I are very different. And I guess this is where, depending on where you come from, or your personality type or whatever, people have very different experiences of this. Because I wrestled with that to a point, but then eventually I came to the point and said to myself, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, because the one that they throw at you is when a man if you look at a woman lustfully in your heart, you might as well have done it.
Yeah.
But the thing is, as a teenager or as an early 20-something, you do that all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it was constant guilt. So you might as well whack off.
Yeah. I think it's a good philosophy. See, we've loved talking about this so much. I can see we've gone over a half an hour. So I think you're right. I think there will be more than one on this. And, lots more stories come to mind even as we've spoken about this. So we will take that into
So what should we
episode.
call this episode? We said it was sex in the church.
I don't give a toss.
I don't give a toss. All right, that's what that'll be called. So I hope you've enjoyed I Don't Give a Toss.
See you later.